regular meeting of August 18th, 2015. We have a forum, and I guess the first item of business is to take a look at the minutes from the meeting of July 21st, 2015.
Make a motion, we approve them as submitted.
Second.
A motion to approve and a second. Any discussion? Everyone's read them? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries, and the minutes from the last meeting are approved. The next item of business is 1005 East Main Street. James and Pamela Hale requesting to replace front door at their residence. Robert, do you have any?
Yes, Chairman Backlund. This property is located, on the north side of East Main Street between Cherry Lane and Park Circle. It was constructed around 1970 in the modern colonial revival style of architecture with a central chimney. It's got a gable roof with brick veneer, and it's 2 stories. This house is a non-contributing structure in the East Main Street Historic District of the National Register of Historic Places. The applicants have been renovating their home for the past couple of years, and they've gotten to the point where they're at the front door, and they would like to replace the current existing door, which is a metal door, with a new 6-panel wood door. And in your agenda materials, you'll see some photographs of of a door, and it's a wood door, like I say, with clear glass and the 6 panels. It's going to have no new transom. It's just the door. And included in your agenda materials also is adjacent properties on both sides of this property. I need to get some clarification on exactly what we're going to be approving today or looking at, because one of the doors that I sent in the agenda package is a little different than what was originally sent to me. So the applicants, when they respond or come up to the podium, they can explain what door they're exactly using. And if I could like to go through some pictures on a monitor here. The one we have here on the front is the front of the house itself. The next is a little closer view of it, and the third one still is the even closer view. The next picture is my feeble attempt to Photoshop a door at the front door, and this is what it looks like of one of the photographs that was sent to me by Miss Hale. And this is the email with the door on it. Following this one, and another door that was sent to me and which we corresponded with was this door here. And we looked at it, and I was kind of assuming that they were both the same doors, and evidently if you look at it closely, they're not. So I need some clarification as to which door that they were wanting to use for their front door. Following this, here is another picture of the house on one side of the dwelling, and this is the other side. The applicants are in the audience, available to answer any questions, and I'll be available as well.
Okay, Mr. and Mrs. Hale, would you care to, or Mrs. Care to come to the podium?
Yes.
And say your name and address.
I'm Pam Hale, 1005 East Main. I'm one of the owners.
Okay, thans. Anybody have any questions for them? Robert, you do, obviously.
Well, yeah, I would just want to clarify which of these doors that you're going to be requesting to have. And I'm assuming they're different now after looking at them closely. Is which one we're going to use? You're going to use
It was
on
the
the door.
one from the Georgia doors. I think it was the first one that I sent, and then you asked me to send.
All right, if we could pull this up on the screen. Now, is this the door we're talking about?
Well, to me, it looks exactly like it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
What's the significant difference you
Well,
found?
on the other photograph that I have, the door The panels are a little bit narrower. And this door here, they're a little bit wider, and they're looks like there's some more depth to
Yes.
the pieces of wood around the windows, around the muntins, I guess. I'm not sure what you call them. Mr. Thompson can probably explain the definitions of around the pieces of wood. Yeah, yeah, those two are the same. So the one we have here, the gardenweb.com, I'm assuming that's the one we're going to use. If that's the case, then that's the one we're going to be looking at.
We have a bunch of pictures here in front of us as well that are also on the screen, and this door here, which is this same door as well, one's just taken from the inside and one's from the outside. Doors are composed of rails, these horizontal members, and stiles, which are the vertical members. And typically on a 6-panel door, the intermediate stile is almost, not quite, but almost of similar size to the outer rails stiles. And the rails, the top one is about usually the same as the two sides and the top, but the middle one and the lower one are always taller. That's just the way they typically are always designed. And this one that was also given to us has a member down the center, the stile, and the rails are much smaller than you would see normally in the horizontal one there, or along the two sides and the top. And so the question is, which one are you wanting to go with? Is it this left one? That one is, I think, more similar to the metal door that you have than the other one because of the narrowness of the rails and stiles in the inner parts there. And we know that the existing door is a replacement because it's a metal door. And I know you wanted to get a bunch of light into
Yes.
the area behind the door. So I think this one is much more similar to what you have than the other one that was also sent to us that I think the rails and stiles in the inner part are just too narrow and don't look like your other door.
Okay.
So I think if you go with something like this, even though the trim that holds the glass in is more bulbous, it's the stock trim that holds the glass in, I think it's a more pleasing composition than this one anyway. So I would say that this door here, which is the one that's also the one in the darker photograph, is reasonable to the other one that's there now. Is the glass going to be beveled, or is it going to be just
It's not
flat?
beveled.
It is going to be beveled.
Yes.
Any other questions or comments from anybody?
I make a motion, we approve the bronze door as submitted.
Second.
Any discussion? We have a motion and a second. Any more discussion on the proposal? All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries, and your proposal is approved. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Next item on the agenda is State of Tennessee Certified Local Government Coordinator Dan Brown is going to talk to us about alternative materials for preservation of historic properties. Thank you, Dan, for coming. I had asked that you come again to one of our meetings to help educate us. We've faced a couple of difficult issues in recent meetings about materials, and so I think we need a refresher every now and then on what is an acceptable type of material for historic properties.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak before you tonight. And again, I'm here to answer a lot of questions. I'll just sort of dive into it with a couple of issues and a couple of approaches towards replacement materials. I think one of the important things to consider with this, and I know you've heard this word before, is precedent. And this is really important specifically because, and when I did my master's work at Tulane, we were fortunate to have we did a semester with the L3s, the law school third-year students in environmental law, and we talked about preservation law. And one thing the professor there went through over and over says, understanding one of the most prevalent precedents used to challenge decisions by certain zoning commissions is, the equal protection clause of the Constitution. And that when things, the first thing you're going to get attacked on is procedure. Did you have a public notice? Did you properly advertise? Did you, was the meeting, conducted like a normal public meeting should? And if you pass that test, you ever get challenged in court, then they'll look for equal protection clause of the Constitution usually, and they'll try to say, well, you've allowed it in these situations within the district, and they'll look through your minutes and stuff like that, and now you're denying this person. And you can't do that. And it's almost, when you go into Chancery Court or any court with that sort of situation, unless you have an extraordinary way to defend yourself, you'll usually lose it. And you've lost the ability to enforce your own regulations at that point. So that's extremely important as understanding precedent. And I will say, in all cities, and you're not a small city anymore, as you know, Murfreesboro is not small, but in my smaller communities, everybody is so familiar with everyone. So that anyone that appears before them is often, in some way related by business or neighborhood or relatives or whatever. It's hard to say no. It's very hard to say that. And I think also and this is where understanding the Public Meetings Act, Sunshine Law, knowing when to recuse yourself for decisions. If you find that there's a personal issue related to the person appearing before you, it's very appropriate and required under the Sunshine Law to recuse yourself from making those decisions. And that's one way to protect yourselves if you're finding yourself in a situation where you're trying to make a decision for someone you know or feel very sympathetic towards because of some relationship. But it's hard. At the same time, in all communities, everyone understands people struggling. And I think the other thing to understand is economic hardship is not, I don't have the money and I don't want to pay it. Economic hardship is a legal process with very clear demonstrated standards that show that you have reduced the basis of the value of the property below zero. So that if what you require of the applicant would destroy essentially the value of the property, and that's economic hardship. Because a lot of people say, well, I can't afford it, that means economic hardship. And that's not the legal basis or determination of economic hardship. So those are important things to understand. But the understanding the importance of precedent and not underestimating the importance of it and thinking, well, I feel a little iffy on this, but we're just, it's so controversial, we're just going to let it go, et cetera. So I think that's an extremely important thing to understand. I find with commissions always something that is struggled with, very much. So I'd mention that. Let's see, with materials, let's dive in with repairs, say, to wood. The materials that are out there, windows. Oftentimes people want to use these epoxies to repair windows. And there's one in particular, and again, this is only because I've taken Bob Yap's window course in Missouri, and I work with window people all around the country at seminars and talk to them. And there's one product called Abitron out there, which is a fiberglass type material that does not shrink, swell, or decay. Okay, and it has been proven for many, many years. Now, of course, any other product that you would feel comfortable understanding, but I will tell you that one is the gold standard for repairing windows, other wood products, any kind of decayed area. Now, understanding with Abitron, and the window people tell them this, is understanding that you're not trapping moisture in there. So if you've got a damp window and you put it in there, it's going to rot that section out. And that usually what they do, a lot of the windows, they'll actually drill a hole in it once they're finished at an angle so the water can't go in. So if like this is the flat surface and rain comes down, you wouldn't drill a hole like that because it might migrate in. You drill a hole kind of like this. So on the hot days, that moisture that's in there will actually have an escape route out of those areas, those repairs. But that's a very viable way to keep historic materials. And it's used a lot, and it's amazing how much of a window or pieces, parts that you can actually repair and or replace with this. And they've got great videos, everything's online, you've got all this instructions of how to do it. And it's relatively it's an expensive material when you buy it. You get this small little thing that's, I don't know, $45, $75, whatever. But, it goes a long way, particularly for repairs.
Could you say the name of that company again and spell
It's
it?
Abatron, Abatron.
Okay.
And again, we don't explicitly, say you should use these products, but it's a product that we have found that's an industry standard, very broadly used for many years, and particularly with window people. I've just had a lot of people say, look, I've used this other stuff, and boy, the Abatron is the material to go to. But, of course, as a public body, I think you have some limitations of requiring those materials, but I would just tell you it's a good, and we as a public body can't require that material, but we often recommend it because it has such a good repair history.
I use it on a number of my historic preservation projects. In fact, the state of Tennessee's historic sites, I use it on window repairs and stuff like that.
State sites.
It's a very good product.
Our agency has about 20 state sites, and this is the material we often recommend. You may use any similar material, but we recommend it's just got a great history out there. So I highly recommend that for wood repairs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's really the other thing, and
Dan,
we're talking about all these synthetics.
Dan,
yes,
before you go past that,
please.
is Abatron something that you just fill rotted areas in versus covering the whole window?
Covering the what?
Is it something that you just fill rotted areas in on
Yes.
the original wood versus covering the whole window?
You can replace muntins. You can actually take an entire muntin, and it's often difficult to do that. I find the best way is usually find a cabinet maker in your area that usually I find that it's not crazy expensive to replace a muntin or part of it. Sometimes you've got a frame. You can usually find somebody that'll work with you. I know I've got a guy in Nashville that's architecture. It's an architect, graduated University of Miami, has his own a shop there, and he'll do window sections for out of mahogany for $300 a section. And I've used him on a couple of projects. When I did the Cairo Rosenwald School, we had to replace a lot of sashes, and so he did it. So, that's inexpensive. Now, I had to put the glass in, and, we had to glaze it and all that kind of stuff. But, this was for historic National Register property that we did that for. So that can be, when you've got one sash that's bad. And it's almost always, of course, the bottom sash. Top sash is shielded by the wood trim over the top up there, and the bottom is usually exposed to weather. And for 19th century and even early 20th century windows, those windows were really never meant to be exposed to the weather all the time. Almost always on 19th century structures, they had shutters. And almost all structures that were well built had some type of shutter system. It was part of the security system of a building. That when people left and were not in the building for a while, they wanted some way to lock it down. So the shutters were an important part of keeping animals out at night. You'd have the shutters. You'd close at night to keep large insects and birds and bats and things from coming in and out of the house, and animals from crawling in and out of the windows. So shutters. And then it was when there were heavy rains or storms coming, the shutters were closed to protect the windows. So the shutters had lifespans 50, 75, sometimes 100 years. So these buildings that are now 75, 100, 125 years old, when people lost those shutters, replacement costs were fairly high, and they noticed the windows looked great. So they went actually one or two generations since that occurred about 1900, and now here another 100 years down the road, or they, in 1950 when they took them off at 35, all of a sudden now we're 75, 60, 50, 75 years down the road, and those windows have been exposed now for 50 cents. They were never really meant, windows were never generally meant to be exposed completely to the weather. Now, what does that mean? Are you going to require people to put shutters back on? I mean, you can't do that. They're very expensive systems in general, shutter systems are. And so I would say this is one way you deal with it. But just give you an idea of the history and kind of how practices, architectural practices are changing. And so, this is part of why that problem exists, the way it exists now. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Let's see. And feel free to interrupt me at any time, and we'll diverge off of any tangents you care to on this. It's exactly what is here tonight to help address your areas of concern or interest. And I figured out what I wanted to talk about again. So I went, in 1999, I had a chance to tour the Washington Monument. It was undergoing, I think it's even been rehabbed since then. But this was the first major rehab of the Washington Monument in 1999. And it was a National Trust conference, and we got the insider tour, with the architects and this kind of stuff. What was interesting to me about it is all of the different artificial materials that they had been applying to this thing since after World War II, is they would think anything high-tech is always better than the old way. And that has been the thinking in our high-tech worlds, especially since World War II, is that high-tech is always going to be the best solution. And for historic properties, it's typically just the opposite. Your best solutions are always going to be your historic materials. Look at the Secretary of Interior standards. It speaks to it very plainly, using original materials repaired and applied in original ways. And that, as we know, that's not possible. Paints have changed very radically. Materials have changed. But whenever possible, that should be our default. Mm-hmm. We go to the historic materials in the best way historically that we can mimic the way that they were applied, repaired, replaced, etc. So that's always where you want to go. But the Washington Monument was just covered with decades of different kind of artificial materials they tried to inject. And so they were pulling all those out, all across the entire surface. And then they were doing Dutchman, repairing with historic materials. And by the time it finally gotten around by 1999 that this is the best way to do the building. So, that was I think a very important lesson. And I think that's always the best default approach. And I think we as a consumer society, and particularly people non-aware of historic preservation and a lot of homeowners, et cetera, always default towards higher tech. Tech is always, just like medicine. The latest medicines are always going to be better than, but as we know, aspirin can be a very good remedy at times. So it gives you a little context to think about it. Caulks in general. I think that, again, from a technical standpoint, we always think of, caulks are easy. We call it liquid carpenter, So instead of often doing repairs, you just pump that caulk in there. And you see 35-year caulk and 50-year caulk, which is actually a comical sort of a description of what those caulks are. Most of those caulks that even say 35 and 50 year are typically 5, 8, if you're lucky, maybe 10-year caulks. Now, they can be very useful for, obviously nail holes and these kind of things. When you put nails in, come back with a little caulk and a 50-year caulk and put a little a dab of that there can be very useful products. But the overuse of caulks is probably, it traps moisture and typically is going to create a lot of problems for you and often exacerbate the damage that's there. So, it's one of the things I don't highly recommend that people use a lot. And it's one thing that everyone defaults to very quickly because it's so easy to apply. And such a low level of craftsmanship, shall we say, that's required to apply it, or tradesmanship. Doors, and let me say with doors. Another thing is hardware, and I think Secretary of Interior standards have not ever in any good way, I think, approached and dealt with hardware. Mm-hmm. So I think it's one issue you may want to think about. I find it's often not that big of a problem, but I've seen people that want to take an 1850 house and then put a brass, 2015 doorknob on the front, and it's very, very inappropriate. And most people's design guidelines don't address hardware, but the Secretary of Interior standards can always, if you're saying, well, we don't have a design guidelines for hardware, you can revert back to the Secretary of Interior standards, which are essentially your 10 commandments. So 10 standards, 10 commandments, and they, just like the 10 commandments, they speak very broadly. Thou shalt not kill. Well, we know, does that mean insects? And how about somebody that's trying to kill me? Well, yes, there are exceptions. Same thing with the Secretary of Interior standards, is that you're going to, these are speak broadly, but it particularly says use historic materials in historic ways. And this is exactly what you can defer to if you have an issue that your design guidelines don't speak to, things like hardware. And I think hardware can be important. At the same time, it's one of those things you definitely don't want to overthink it. You know, it can be replaced, and it's often not the most critical element. Roofs. Let's talk about roofs. We I think have in the past typically recommended to jurisdictions that they minimize control of roofs because they're replaceable. You know, a lot of people, we often don't know what the original roof was. You know, three-tab asphalt shingle, was it originally green? Was it originally a lighter color? You know, green was a very big default here in the mid-20th century and that kind of stuff. But the biggest issue out there now I'm finding for roofs is these very, you know, lime, coral red, sort of magnetic blue roofs, metal roofs that they're selling. And these roofs will last a long time. They're actually, from a standpoint of survivability, they're very good products, but they're often extremely inappropriate in historic neighborhoods and for historic houses. And when you put them on, you're going to have them for 50 years, possibly, and at least 20 or 30 for sure. And they're often a visually shocking element. Even looking down the street from a distance, you can see that lime green roof and amongst these other natural. Whereas if someone's going from a 3-tab asphalt shingle green to a 3-tab asphalt shingle gray, who cares? You know, it's like paint, really. It's more about replacing materials in kind. 3-tab asphalt shingle, go to 3-tab asphalt shingle, unless someone can say, well, it originally had tile on it. It originally had it was a metal roof that was pressed metals. Then, you know, those are always things that any sort of precedent that was there physically is a good deference to any kind of decision that you have to make. But I think these brightly colored roofs and particularly radical changes in materials, corrugated metal can be appropriate in some areas. In other areas, that can be actually a very poor choice for re-roofing a roof. And so I would say have something in your guidelines and review your guidelines to feel that you are comfortable with what you have there and that it would protect you from things like changing to a corrugated roof from an asphalt shingle or these brightly colored metal roofs. Some of them are standing seam, some of them are just a pattern to them. But I find those can be very visually intrusive into districts, and before you know it, you've got 6 or 8 of them in the district, and it can be, once everyone sees it and they talk to their neighbors, and I want that too, that can be very difficult to turn those down. Windows. Let's talk about windows. You know, what are your issues that you're always going to be dealing with? And of course, it's going to be windows. It's going to be siding. It's going to be doors. And as I probably have said this to you before, we ought to let the window people do the fundraising for historic preservation because, boy, they can sure sell people and stuff, okay? And if you notice now, you don't see any more window commercials where they talk about this will save you X number of dollars a month. The federal government made them stop because it was actually false information, and it could not be supported by any reasonable study. So they made them stop advertising. You could save so much per month and stuff like that. And the truth is, for almost all window replacements, where they want to take all the windows out and the historic wooden windows and replace them completely, in almost all cases, and again, there's been the National Trust and a lot of groups have been studying this now for the last 15 years, 10 or 15, very intensely, particularly the last 5 years. In almost all cases, they will never pay for themselves. Or you're looking at a 45-year, 60-year recovery on these window systems that you put in. Also, anything that is maintenance-free means it can't be repaired. Okay, that's the code word for you can't repair it. It's maintenance-free. And I find that most of these window products, and particularly on the lower end, the vinyl windows and things like that, are going to typically fail as far as providing you with a superior level of insulation or operability or anything like this, particularly insulation and protection and stuff like this, they're going to lose those seals around their brake. They will have lost any special insulating value they have, usually in less than 12 to 15 years, sometimes as little as 6, 8, 10 years. And when the vinyl begins deteriorating and sagging, and you've seen those, particularly in the suburbs, a lot of times the vinyl windows, when they start sagging, it's sort of like when I start sagging, there's just nothing much that can be done for me. You know, I've gone past the point of return. So I can try to doctor it up and wear bigger clothing and stuff. But, you know, there's just the same thing with these windows. It's once that stuff is gone, it's gone. And you can't repair it, you can't replace it. But the best economic studies out there are consistently telling us that these products and these replacements typically never pay for themselves, and that you will be on a much shorter cycle, particularly like a 15 to 25 year cycle of total replacement that essentially will never pay for itself. So those are very poor systems. Also, a lot of them, one of the biggest problems you're going to have for historic replacements is meeting the profiles. Your styles and rails, you know, they're going to be different sizes, okay? And they're not going to have the same width. They won't have the same profile on the edges. And they generally can't. You know, these windows, these modern systems, they're inexpensive to produce, but the molds to make them are wildly expensive, okay? So that to come up, you think, well, wow, it's so easy. Why shouldn't they be able to just do anything we want? You could give them any kind of design. And I thought that years and years ago. I thought this is actually, we'll come up with some products down the road, and you'll be able to give them, they can just make it, you know, and you'll get it next week or in a few days or something. Well, the machines to make it are getting more and more expensive, but they mass produce. They'll do the same thing. So they usually have a couple of profiles, and that's it, and they're almost never historic. Now, there's a handful of Marvin Windows and a few of these others do some very good products. They actually select the lumber that they choose. There's actually a lumber out there, and I haven't seen any use of it, but I saw it at a conference called Accoya wood, which is a vinegar-injected wood that supposedly, and the studies I've seen on it say it's supposed to have the same survivability characteristics of old-growth lumber. And I'm waiting to see it used in a jurisdiction yet. We haven't seen it used yet. But I think something like that, it's not poisonous. It's vinegar. It's not poisonous, and it permeates the entire wood system they use to apply. Yes, ma'am.
How do you spell that? I didn't.
Accoya. You Google it, and I had them send me some samples. I got some samples at the office. You've all got my card there. You're welcome to email me if you want. And again, on my card there is my cell phone number and my email at work. So any of you are welcome to communicate with me. Are some of you on my email tree? When I send it out to get the notices, any of you that want to be on my email tree or my listserv, let me know. We just announced a new CLG in Jefferson City, so you would have gotten an email from me in the last week. If you would like to be on that list, just give me a card tonight or something, or give me your email address, and I'll add you to that list. So anyone that wants to be on it, we add them to the list, and then you can easily. Get the general information when I send it out. But then I also got my email address on that card and my cell phone. Okay. You're welcome to call me at any time, okay? So, yes.
Well, Dan, back to this Accoya, what wood do they start out with to inject with vinegar?
And again, my memory's not good on this. I want to say they're starting with a fir, or they're not using southern yellow pine, or they're really inexpensive woods. They're using a nicer wood, but they're permeating it. You know, it's a commercial wood. They're not using any kind of specialized grown wood or anything. They're taking commercially available woods and impregnating them with this. And I actually talked to people. I got some samples and spoke to them, and I couldn't find any weaknesses in the product. The only criticism I heard checking on the internet was that you have to treat it specially when you paint it, because vinegar doesn't take paint well, so there's a special kind of coating that you have to put as a base coating to put your paint on, or if not, it's not going to hold paint. And that's the only criticism I heard of it. So I didn't have anyone else that was able to criticize. You can work it. It's not poison. You know, pressure treated wood, a lot of people don't realize when you build these decks and stuff, it's actually poisonous to work with. It's got arsenic in it and some pentachlorophenols often and things like this. And when you breathe that in or get it on your hands, if you actually read their online information on pressure-treated wood, they'll tell you wear gloves when handling it. Be careful, I think, early on after it's applied, if it's damp, to be careful about bare feet on it and stuff like that until it sort of weathers and builds a surface on it. So pressure-treated wood is often a questionable product to use where you're going to have human contact, feet, things like that. And the Sequoia supposedly has no chemical issues with it. It's vinegar. It's not vinegar and arsenic or something. It's vinegar. So it's apparently, but I haven't seen it used anywhere yet. I'm really interested to hopefully try to see it used. Now, I think it's not inexpensive. That's the other item. But that they're saying the lifespan on it is projected to be the same as old growth timber. They're looking at 100 to 200 years or more of lifespan on this, particularly if it's protected from the weather and stuff. So I just throw that out there as an idea. I think these things, we'll see some of these products are going to get, and I think this is a great way to take some natural materials and make a new product out of it. So I think we're going to see some more of this. But windows, I think, are our biggest character-defining element that's facing our strongest challenges with replacements and repairs on them. But I will tell you, getting repairs done, and I teach some classes on windows. I do some hands-on stuff around the state and go out and do that. Like I say, I've been to Bob Yap's class, and wherever I go, I try to see if there's a window person there. It used to be every handyman in the world could repair windows. I mean, it was, you could re-rope them and do minor repairs to windows. It was something that every handyman dealt with. Mm-hmm. And what has happened is now everyone thinks of this exotic lost art. It's not. It's so basic that when you tell people, now, a lot of the window guys have in my mind, they've overthought it. So they've made what they do to these windows. They pull them out and they strip them down to the bare wood. Well, you don't need to do that, okay? And you can do that. I mean, that's a museum level kind of reworking of the windows. And then they put special, brass strips in the window channels, and then they do tubing on the edges and stuff that involves taking the window out and rabbiting it and all these kinds of things. And I think that the basic, what the old handyman used to do, which was coming up and re-roping them and essentially making sure that any paint that was clogging it up and things like this was removed, and then repainting the windows, is a very straightforward, simple thing to do that will address 90 to 99% of what the average homeowner is looking to do. So that when they get these, you've got to put this tubing in, you want to do these brass channels, and then you've got to you strip it down to the bare wood, those all of a sudden push the expenses too high, and they're unnecessary. They're not necessary for the preservation of wood or even for a good job. It's kind of overkill. I find, the carpenters, a lot of carpenters that work on this are really cabinet. They're really fine, detailed people with very high levels of woodworking skills, and they have such high standards. Most of them are real craftspeople. Some of them border on artists. And I find that they just get a little too focused on how to do it perfect, They're thinking of that finished piece of furniture inside the house rather than, how to just approach windows and do it. But I would tell you, if you can find, and I've been finding these guys around the state. I've got a couple in Nashville now that I'm sure would run down here. In fact, I had one in Nashville, took him over to a job in Lebanon. The guy on the square in Lebanon had two little row buildings. And I had talked to him on some other project. He said, well, you said you can help me with this. I want to see if you can do it. And you said it wouldn't be any more expensive. And I don't know, but I'm going to give you a shot. So he pulled me out there and said, I got these two windows. And a lot of times with these commercials, they don't want the windows to be operable. They're never going to open them. It's on the second story. Mm-hmm. And particularly even like courthouses, you can't have courthouse windows that open anymore. It doesn't allow proper security. So you're not trying to get double hung windows anymore, okay? Essentially, you're going to put them in place and just want to make sure they look good and that they're sound. So sure enough, got a guy over there, and he did a great job, cost less money than the replacements they were looking for, which were these like 8-foot tall windows or something, So they did a replacement, and then all of a sudden he picked up 2 to 3 more jobs right after that, where these developers were working around town. So now we've got a guy over in Lebanon that's working on these projects, and they were going in with vinyl replacement, the cheapest thing they could find. So I'm finding these guys are out there, and I talked to this guy, I worked with him, I said, look, don't overthink this. Don't come in there talking about the brass channels and the tubing. I said, you're going to push yourself out. And I said, that's not what they want. It's not what they need. I said, this will work just fine. And he's real happy. They're real happy. So these solutions are out there. And again, I'm here to help facilitate those. If you find you've got I come and work directly with business building owners and business people. So I will come down and give technical advice to help because I find once you do it one time, it's like teaching that person to fish rather than giving them a fish. Once you do that, it's exponential as to how that expands in these, because that word gets out. Yes?
I've found that a lot of owners look at the windows and they see the peeling paint and they think the windows are rotten. And if you go in there and you try to train them to look at what they're really seeing, and they finally realize that it's the paint that's pulling away from the wood. If you try to replace those windows, you're going to get like a pine or something else, and it's just simply not going to last. And that old growth wood in the windows is still in very good condition. That's when you use the Abatron to make repairs.
I find it's 95 to 99% there, and usually, like you say, it's just a crackled paint surface and a peeling paint. I know Kay Graybill and I, who runs the Knoxville program, she's the full-time preservation planner over in Knoxville. A couple of years ago, she called me in, and Kay used to be the planning director for Wilmington, North Carolina, and she's got unbelievable planning skills, got a master's in preservation. She didn't have I have a background in contracting too, and I have a hands-on experience with this, and I think I told y'all before, the French Quarter in New Orleans, I used to be deputy director of the agency that oversaw all the historic work down there. So we pulled, she pulled me in for a day, and we went around and just looked at these stuff, and she was saying they want to replace these windows and these windows. And once we got over there, we stopped it all. There was some guy that was talking $15,000 to $20,000 to try to replace these windows in this building, and there wasn't one window that needed. I didn't see any rotted wood, period. Yeah. But the peeling paint, the homeowner was just, people that don't have a lot. I think probably everyone in this room that's dealt with these older products and stuff, you see it, you understand it, you realize, well, that's not that bad. But the average homeowner, peeling paint means it's dead. It can't be helped. And particularly when the window person goes, oh, this is bad, as bad as I've ever seen. And you better do something for it. That's probably rotting your wall out in there. And, of course, you're losing all your heat. The truth is, heat loss in your house is 80% through your ceiling and roof and attic. If you really want to save heat loss in your house, insulate your attic. And then it's mostly going to be coming out of doors, the doors that aren't properly sealed around the edges. And believe it or not, light fixtures, and particularly in homes, they often had cut that hole, ran the electrical down, they screwed it up, and you've got this a tiny little gap there. But that's where the air goes out. Heat rises, it doesn't go horizontally very well. And if you are concerned about it, interior storms. Google interior storms, you're going to get about 400,000 responses on Google. And essentially, there's all kinds of inexpensive systems. I've seen them as little as $10. I think that's ridiculous. Probably not a very good product, but particularly in that $30 to $40 range per windows, and definitely under $100 for the tip top, finest, most extravagant system for interior storms is $100 a window, and it will accomplish almost always give you the same amount of insulation than a new set of windows. So I've got to replace it. I'm losing so much money on the insulation. And I think most people almost never use their windows, but these are set up on either a spring system or an inner tube system or a magnet system, and they got little handles on the side, and if you say, well, I'll open this 15, 20 times a year and I don't want to lose that, you wouldn't want to screw anything in. Well, these are just pop right out. You set them on the side for that beautiful day that you do want the windows open. I've seen these systems go in around the state a lot. I don't know anybody that's dissatisfied with them. They work very well. And they do that. The moderate that control of the heat loss that people feel they're experiencing. There are a couple of other systems you can do. One of them's called curtains. Literally just having curtains that you can close in the wintertime. It really is a form of insulation that stops air from moving. if there is any air loss there. And of course, people talk about, well, I have to get, some type of coating on the windows. I need these glass. I get this new one. I get this glass that has thermal coatings and stuff. Curtain shears essentially accomplishes 100% of whatever these very expensive new windows would cost you. The worst one I ever heard is, we have a city, and I won't name names, but 1820 house, okay, original windows in it. And the commission called me, they didn't know what to do. The mayor of this town bought the house, and his wife, they came to the commission told them they couldn't replace the windows, they replaced them all anyway. Okay, so finally, and then they had the audacity to call us looking for grants to help with the rest of the work on the house, So I was able to speak with the lady of the house, one of the owners, and I just said, what happened? Why did this happen? Why did she say, well, we had to do it. Had to. I said, why? She says, you just can't clean them any other way. She said, the new windows, you just can lean them in and clean them, and said the old 1820s windows, you had to go outside and clean them. So I had to replace them. And it was the only time I've heard that as a necessary excuse, but that was the reason that and of course we had a problem with enforcement there because, as you know, the mayor would have to, it's a very small community, the mayor would have had to actually have codes enforce a violation against he and his family, so it didn't happen. It was a terrible loss, but I did convince them. I said, please keep the sashes. They just took the sashes out. They said, well, they've been preserved. I said, because the day will come when you or someone else will want to replace those sashes. And so we've done that in a few situations. So we had a schoolhouse, a historic schoolhouse, I want to say 1920s and 30s. Same thing is that I went over there and talked to them and said, there's no reason to do this. Here's what you can do. Well, the window salesman had gotten a hold of them. So they ended up tearing them out, but I convinced them keep the sashes. And the day will come when those sashes will, I think, go back in. But I guess getting back on the window track is if I can be a resource to you to help with any of these issues, if you got it becomes controversial, if they're just, people don't want to, and you in any way think I might be a help with that, and I'm happy to come meet with those individual business owners to get if you feel I can get something over the hump, and that's what I did in Lebanon. We got over the hump there, and now it's they're just doing all these things the right way, and they're on the way to becoming a CLG too. I've been working with them 4 years. For them, it's been a political issue. And so they just have to read to the climate's right, because there's a lot of anti-government anything often. And so that has been a lot of the situation there. But it's changed. They've got a Main Street program. They now have a historic district. They've got historic zoning, and they're going to be a CLG soon. So
Dan,
yes.
You mentioned CLG. Could you just explain what a certified local government is and how that functions?
Yes, certified local government program is actually technically a federal program through the National Park Service. It's part of the core federal programs that they offer to cities, and it's funded partly. 60% of my work is funded by the federal government for this reason. Same thing with tax credits, 106, a National Register. Those are all programs, and CLG is part of that. And what that is it's all local. The biggest mistake is people think, oh, you're inviting the federal or state government, and I'm a state employee, but you're inviting them in to oversee what you do and control you. It's all local. It's local control. It's local ordinance. It's local representatives. It's local commissioners. It's local administration. I'm invited into communities. I have no statutory power. I have no control, and there's no control by the state. But what we do is help communities establish their ordinances to meet the state legislation, state statute, and then we help them on a day-to-day or month, as an ongoing assistance with training, which is hopefully some of what I'm doing this evening. Also with grants, you have a very distinct grant opportunity, so that if you apply for a grant, and it can be used for brick and mortar, it can be used for master planning, it can be used to redo your design guidelines, it can be used to update your National Register nominations for your city. And I would say every year we do 1 or 2 set of design guidelines for a CLG. We do a ton of brick and mortar. It needs to be a public building, and it needs to be. We do I'd say half of the buildings we do are courthouses and or libraries. A lot of public libraries, or a public building and it's historic fabric. It's not replacing or repairing the restrooms. It has to be, you know, we do a lot of roofs, foundations, windows, doors, mortar, you know, mortar repair, things like that. But it is 10% of the money we get from the government has to go to certified local governments, or it goes back to Congress. So part of my year, my job every year is giving money away, and it's real dollars out there. 60-40 matching grants, but your matching can be in kind up to a certain extent. So I will help you write it, and I will vet it before you submit it to make sure that it's successful as it can be. I have yet, since I've been here in my 4 years, to assist a certified local government with an application that they didn't get it.
So we're a certified local government. We're certified to do what?
Your certification means that you have met the standards that the National Park Service establishes, which basically means you're meeting a minimum of 4 times a year, that you are following your state enabling legislation, you're participating in training, and that you meet the state sunshine law, you're maintaining public records, you're following your local and state legal standards for how to conduct a historic zoning commission, and that you're participating and you've signed a contract with the state saying that you will agree to function by the law under that. So your certification doesn't, it certifies you to apply for grants with an exceptional level of advantage, okay? And it just, your power to function as Historic Zoning Commission comes from local ordinance, not from anything that you would get by doing this. We probably have about 50 or so cities that have historic zoning commissions that aren't certified local governments, and except for maybe a handful, about 5 or 6, almost all of those have, in one way or another, semi-fallen by the wayside. They aren't doing training, they get frustrated, they have problems with enforcement, and there's not a system back there to back them up and help them and come. You know, a lot of what I spend my time doing is I don't spend a lot of time in large cities like this or Nashville. I mean, you know, you've got full-time, you've got a city attorney here tonight. They're not, you know, interpreting your legal issues aren't something you often need me for. The smaller communities, they can get frustrated very easily. They don't have the resources, so I spend a lot of time there. With the larger city, if there's anything I do, it's things like training. And we have the state conference every year. You get free attendance. You're certified for free attendance every year at the state conference. It'll be in Chattanooga. I don't think they've chosen a date for it. It's in spring. I think it's in April or May. And again, I send out my notices, and I think you get them, Mr. Lewis, and to say, hey, it's free. We'd love to have you here. So that's exactly, you know, what that offers you. Does that help? Does that kind of give you a sense of what the CLG program is?
So it's certified to help so that our historic zoning commission can operate autonomously.
Well,
is that correct?
It means you're following the state enabling legislation.
Okay.
So the ones that aren't certified, they're often not, you know, there's no one there to help them regularly with keeping on that straight and narrow path, you know, and helping to make sure that you have support when you have challenges. Because what often happens in smaller communities, if there's a very challenging issue that's controversial and the commission isn't supported or something, that then they lose, you know, interest, the commissioners. And then sometimes you'll get a new mayor in that the Historic Zoning Commission was the old mayor's idea, you know. So when a new one comes in, they don't appoint new commissioners. They don't support the activities of the commission. So we're there to maintain regular contact, and so that when those issues do arise, we're there to help come in and often communicate with the administration, and our administration can. The State Historic Preservation Officer can call the city mayor and say, you know, one of the issues that often happens in smaller communities is the city council and or mayor and or planning commission assume they have authority over the Historic Zoning Commission. And they say, well, I'm not going to let you do that. You know, you don't have the right. Of course, you answer to Chancery Court. You know that's who you answer for the decisions that you make. And that appeal power, you know, Memphis tried years ago to say, well, they changed their ordinance and said that appeals would go to city council. They're not going to go to Chancery Court. The state attorney, the attorney general stepped in and issued an opinion and said very clearly the statute does not allow that. You know, it's very clear in the statute that it has to go to Chancery Court and that the city may not alter it because it's not allowed under the state statute. That's enabling legislation. It enables you to do what's in the parameter of that statute. So I do a lot of interpretation with the statute, particularly in smaller communities. Just got a call this afternoon from a community over in East Tennessee, and they said that the Board of Zoning Appeal was trying to say that they had the authority over changing a decision by the Historic Zoning Commission. And so that's an issue I'm dealing with. I do that a lot. That's a lot of what I do. And then technical advice. I give a lot of technical advice. And I tell communities, I'll help anybody any way you can. But when CLG become part of the CLG family, it's about 2,000 nationwide and 35 here in the state of Tennessee. And again, the training, the grants. And I always tell everyone, don't always, be like my wife. Don't always listen to me. Okay? Okay? Care about me a lot. We're going to have a great relationship, but don't listen to me all the time. Go out there and talk to the other CLGs and the other nearby communities when you have a question, or you got a legal question, or your coordinator. It's like, yeah, Dan's saying this and this, but how do you really handle it up there? How does it really work? We know that Dan's telling you giving you but he ain't giving you the good gin. And let me tell you how we really deal with these little small problems. So, and I tell people, no offense taken if you don't always listen to me. No one's ever been. The only power I have is to recommend. I can't I can recommend decertification. It's never been done. It's never been recommended. But so that if someone said, and the only case would be a community that said we don't want to do it anymore. Yeah. We're against it. Then we might be certified. That's the only real power I have. But that's what I encourage people. When we do our training, I think one of the most valuable parts of it, when we go to the conferences and stuff, is that you get to meet other people in other cities. And I find that those relationships that you build are really much as valuable, or often more valuable relationship that you could build with our office or me or whatever, because those are the people that are like you, volunteers out here in the trenches fighting with it. And how do y'all dealing with it over in Nashville, or how are you dealing with it in Chattanooga, or Cookeville, or a lot of communities that are up and coming and also dealing with a lot of issues. Let's see, siding, big one. Okay, hardy plank. Let's throw this one in there. Hardy plank is one of the few materials that can be, and let me emphasize, can be acceptable as a substitute material, but it's sort of like I guess makeup or whatever. You got to be careful not to use too much of it. Okay, too much of a good thing can be bad. So I think that it can be applied sparingly, particularly for the rear of houses, or particularly for ancillary structures that are setting back away from the road. But say putting them on the facade, or particularly removing fairly intact materials like wood and stuff and replacing it is uncalled for and not considered, would be considered contrary to the Secretary of Interior standards. I will tell you, in the French Quarter, we allowed it. We had 5 categories for buildings, all the way from National Historic Landmark down to non-contributing. Okay, and then we had, of statewide significance, National Register statewide significance. You had local significance and something other of importance. So we didn't allow it on the top 2 categories. On any National Historic Landmarks or National Register of state importance, those were never allowed on those structures. And so, but when we had these, we had some of these buildings that were a foot apart, and so when you really couldn't get in there and paint very well, so we'd allow them when they did the replacement one time, maybe there, particularly on 2nd or 3rd stories that you couldn't see on the rear of buildings and things like that. From an aesthetic standpoint, it's an inferior material. The profiles are never going to read the same, but it can have its uses. Okay, I'd say this is hard, because what you want to do is set up rules that don't require your interpretation, that the administrator can approve, through administrative approval. And if you don't have that, do y'all have administrative approval here, Mr. Lee? Okay, that's extremely important. I tell communities, do not make someone wait 6 weeks to come talk to you to put on a roof that's a 2-day job. This is exactly how the public will turn on you. From an asphalt, 3-tab asphalt shingle, 3-tab asphalt, it's so important to have that administrative approval. So I applaud that. And also, let me applaud having the city attorney's office represented each meeting. That's so important and so critical to good decision making and supporting good decisions. But with your siding, of course, vinyl and aluminum. And I've gone to a couple of cities and said, we want to become a CLG, and I would say 80% of the buildings in that city had either vinyl or some type of siding on it. And the siding people got in there, and these cities, it just started happening, and all of a sudden, 5 or 6 years, it's everywhere. And it's on some of the nicer houses and stuff. I mean, we've even got, Franklin, which is so focused on historic stuff. There's way too much of it that gets on in that environment. It's well sold. And it's often just not, it will hold moisture in on houses with siding on it in that 20 or 30 year period. And particularly if you do that hollow fill where you go into the walls and you fill it up with that cellulose fiber inside, that can work in your attic to a certain extent. But when you do the walls, and you don't have a moisture barrier in there, think of a cold glass of iced tea sitting out on a patio on a hot, humid day. What happens? Water collects on the outside. The same thing happens in your house. You've got air conditioning, which we never had, broadly used up until the 1950s or 40s or 50s in the United States. So you crank that air conditioning up. Well, and all the new houses have a moisture barrier. That pink stuff, that Tyvek, that's your moisture barrier. So that when you cool the inside of that house, the moisture cools on that Tyvek. If you notice, they'll have a space there, and then it can go down. And with old houses, there's no moisture barrier in there. So when you cool it on the inside, it comes in. If there's insulation, it sits on your insulation. And over the long run, it's going to have toxic mold. The same thing when you insulate with siding. And a lot of times they'll put an insulation under it. But when you cool like that, that water is going to accumulate usually on the back side of that insulation. And it eventually, particularly over decades, will break it down. And you then in 30 to 50 years, you can have a house that really can't have enough rot in it or a mold situation that's actually toxic. So this happens a lot out there. People if you've ever seen that cellulose fiber that's been there for years, if people are ever working on those old houses, you put your hands down in it, it's damp. It's moist, and it has that moldy smell to it and stuff. So I highly recommend against. Of course, interiors you don't control, we don't talk to, we don't address. But particularly for siding, etc., highly recommend that not be allowed as a product. And some of it's one of the basics: windows, siding, and windows are, again, as we've talked about, some of the most controversial. Some other things you don't hear about much: walkways, driveways, things like that. I think you get a lot of people want to do a cherry red Bowmanite, which the Bowmanite's a stamped pattern. So I want to have something that looks like Paris, France cobblestone. Well, those can be really inappropriate kinds of, and it's really expensive versus concrete, asphalt, gravel. Just basic historic. And one of the problems we have a lot of historic downtowns is they want to put Cape Cod light poles, and they want to do benches from New York City, and then they want to do Bowmanite stamped cobblestone that looks like it's from Italy or something like that. And those are, as you know, very inappropriate ways to rework and expensive. So I think, particularly for walkways and sidewalks, I have a lot of people say, well, we're going to redo our sidewalks downtown. What do you recommend? I said, what has it been historically? And it's almost always concrete. I said, just do make it easy on yourself. It's going to look right. It's going to work right. It's going to last right. And I said, it's really typically the best. Same thing with sidewalk. People want to get fancy in front of their houses. Now, sometimes you can do brick set in there, but a lot of times they want to do the modern compressed brick. Those can work sometimes. That's decisions for y'all to make if you feel like it looks good. But those are, kind of can be expensive systems. Often the less expensive and the most useful and longest lived are going to be historical asphalt, concrete, even bricks, brick patterns down there, easy to set, and then gravel, can be a very nice product to use. Let's see. Back doors, walks, drives, siding, roofs. Okay. I think I've hit some of the high spots here. Are there some materials and or situations that you want to play stump the chump? You want to try to stump me on a couple of...
We have been approached in times past about PVC for railings and on porches or decks, and sometimes for like lattice. And on very rare occasions, we have approved that just because the lattice is so difficult to maintain. Of course, PVC is going to get that algae on it and turn green at some point. So it's a very difficult thing.
I will tell you that the areas that these things can be workable, particularly cornices and architectural detail, dentailing, and things like that, because you paint it out in particular, you really can't tell. We've got in Jonesboro, if any of you have ever been to Jonesboro, if you haven't, you get a chance to go over to East Tennessee. It's a beautiful community. They built Bill Kennedy. If you don't know Bill Kennedy, one of the great preservationists in Tennessee, one of my preservation heroes in the United States. And a little side note, when I went to visit the Washington Monument in 1990, I met Bill Kennedy. He was on a bus with me. We were riding up there together. So Bill has spent he's I think a surgeon over there, spent his life in that community, particularly the last 30 years, in focusing on historic preservation. And Bill is, boy, you talk about a stickler. I mean, every now and then he'll tell me, well, here's what we do. And I say, man, that's tough, Bill. I said, I don't know if we can sell that anywhere else in the state. I said, but it's pretty amazing. But even for their downtown, their main structures on their main drag to the middle of the city, they're using some plastic replacement parts at the cornice lines and things like that.
Fiberglass?
Fiberglass and things like that. So, and they're painting it out. And I've actually gone and looked at them as I've traveled through, and I can't. You have to really look and have a really good eye and be very experienced to go, oh, now that I've looked at it, I can see it. Now, I think, again, it's the thing of being used like hardy plank. It has to be used very judiciously and very carefully. If not, I went through a couple of cities, and these people go up with the vinyl fencing and stuff, and around businesses and things at the back and things like that, 6 foot tall vinyl fencing. You talk about make a terrible statement, but people are looking at pricing, and they just got this price, and they'll go in there and they just start pounding. I have these rights, this is not hurt anything. It's and so, and then people, commissions go, we were confused on it, and I think now we don't like the way it looks. What do we think? What do you think? And I said, I think you're right. It's not an appropriate material, but you've now set a very dangerous precedent in your community. So that's why it's really important to be very judicious with fiberglasses and plastics, and particularly this plastic fencing out front, which is all the big box retailers are selling, and it's supposed to look like wood picket fence. I've never seen it do it. I don't think it's ever appropriate, and that's, of course, is so visible. Now, if somebody's saying on the back of a house you can't see from the road, and it's the hand railing on my patio, I think a lot of communities don't even regulate what you can't see from the road.
We don't.
Okay, so if you can't see it from the road, it's not even an issue to be brought before the commission. But I would say those are the issues where I think it can be appropriate, and some trim details and things like that. Because a lot of times replicating some of those very complicated cornices can be very financially devastating. Same thing, Jonesboro found that. They just thought that it was going to be so expensive to redo that out of copper or whatever. So those are some others. Any other particular issues you'd like to bring up? Or
One question that we had come up a couple of months ago was a house in the district that may have vinyl siding on it, and they want to replace the siding. And historically, the house would not have had vinyl siding, of course. And I don't remember what the status of that house is. I think it was contributing to the district.
Right.
Not nationally or state significance, but, what if they wanted to go in and fix it,
right,
what should they do?
Great question. All districts, when they were set up, had non-conforming structures with non-conforming exterior materials on them. And under the law, you're allowed to keep any of that and do minor repairs to it, just like signage in downtowns. When you come in with the downtown zoning, you're not going to allow plastic internally lit signs, but all the ones that are there can stay. Now, when it's time to replace the sign, it's got to go to historically appropriate signage. Same thing with exterior on houses. It was non-conforming situation that existed at the time of the ordinance, and as such, it's allowed to be repaired. But when it comes time to replace it, you have to go to something that complies with the design guidelines. So, and that's legally defensible. I mean, that's usually, even if it's a non-historic area, if you take strip malls or whatever, when they come, they're going to have signage ordinances. The cities now, when they're coming in and doing new strip malls, even strip malls, they're coming in where you got to do a sidewalk out front. You see these strip malls with a block with a sidewalk, nobody else got it. Why? Because there's these new standards coming in, and when you redo that parking lot, you got to put sidewalk in. You're going to have to put in some landscaping buffers, and you have to do now you got to put in your parking, and they're regulating stuff now. So it was non-compliant. It allowed to exist the way it was. When it comes time to do major replacement repair, major repair. It's time to bring it into compliance, and that's legally defensible, whether it's historic or not. So I would highly recommend you would bring it into compliance at that point. One thing I didn't mention, wood porches, okay? It's probably, the thing on houses that needs replacing the most, and a lot of people in the 20th century, particularly on 19th century houses, sometime in the 60s or 70s, tore the wood out, often put concrete in there because it was just like, wood was such an issue. I find, and these, again, it's one of these of being, there are some good synthetic wood, they're typically part wood and part polymer that have the color of wood. They're actually gray or something like that. And I've seen those where they can be acceptable because, again, the old growth lumber that porches were made out of can be very, it's not available. So the wood that's there is usually a higher quality wood. That's usually comes out of a heartwood or something like that. So those can give you a lifetime. I mean, you can get 30 plus to 50 years even out of the woods that are out there now, particularly if you paint them. Standard old battleship gray, porches, and just get that decent wood that's commercially available, put it on your porch and paint it, and you'll get a lifetime out of it, typically. But that can be acceptable for the porch itself, particularly if the detailing is done in wood. But again, you just have to be judicious, see how visible it is. And of course, they're predicting 100-year lifespans for that stuff. The stuff I've seen, though, and I've seen a lot of things like historic golf courses go to, because guys are in there with their golf shoes and they're tearing stuff up all the time. I don't like the way it looks after a while. To me, it looks phony, and it doesn't look real. It doesn't read real. You put it down, and when you get up to it, you can see it, and you think, it's not that bad. But I find over time, I find ultraviolet degradation of it. It's not performing the way they said it would. And let me say that with synthetic materials. French Quarter, one of our biggest issues, slate roofs. Slate roofs were wildly expensive. So we required them on national, the top two, okay? And on those middle ones, we let them do imitation slate or something like that. Well, they would come in, this stuff will last 200 years. And so we just said, we need to see a building that it's been on for 5 years. Can you show us one example that we can go look at where it's been? And they would say, I remember one sample was they said, well, it's fireproof. And I remember a guy got a lighter out in a meeting and lit the edge of it, took it away, and it burned. It was just like, you had to put, the stuff just started flaming, They will say anything, okay? The other thing, now, I don't think you control painting here, do you?
No.
Okay. One thing I'll tell you about paints, though, and there's been a lot of research done at the National Center for Preservation, Training, and Technology in Natchitoches, Louisiana. How did it get there? Because there was a senator from Louisiana that when it got time to build that multi-million-dollar center, got it out in the middle of nowhere in Natchitoches. It should be in some place like, the middle of the country or something like that. But they do all this research. PhDs are sitting out there. Then a lot of research on paint. But these elastomerics, if there's anybody that asks your opinion, or you can say, you can't require it, but his recommendation, elastomeric paint is rubber. It's a rubber coating that you put on the houses, and essentially it does not breathe. Whatever it covers, it essentially holds the moisture in, and it will deteriorate. And they will make every claim under the sun that this stuff is vapor permeable. It has a vapor permeability, but there is no, and I've talked to the PhDs. In fact, I did it a couple of months ago. I'm going to try to write up a paint recommendation for the state. I'm going to write up one on the current research, and it'll come out in the next month or so, hopefully, that'll talk about what can work. The biggest issue is paint on brick buildings. Don't allow brick buildings that haven't had paint, typically should not be painted. Now, modern buildings built after the 1960s or something like that, those bricks don't really have a lot of moisture in them. They can't be, but all that up until World War II stuff, soft brick. When you cover it with paint, and it takes a long time. Paris, Tennessee, Lee School, 1880s, has started having some deterioration with their mortar, and they pulled me in, and starting 50 or 60 years ago, they started painting the building. And I said, you've got moisture. It's been held in here now for 50 or 60 years. It's deteriorating the lime-based mortar in the building. And they're undergoing a 30 or 40,000. I'm going to be going over there next week to work out how we're doing the details on it. But they have deteriorated that structure to a point now that's gotten expensive. Well, we're trying to correct it, but they says, we're going to paint it. No, it's been 50 or 60 years. It's got to be painted. But there is a vapor permeable water-based latex that they actually have reached a point now that has some vapor permeability to it that can work, but the vapor permeability works on one layer. So if you do 2 or 3 layers on the paint, or you repaint it down the road, you're going to lose your true permeability. So these are the issues we're going to talk about with houses and stuff. Now for wood, you want it to be. That can be good to have those latex. Latex is a layer of plastic, is all it is. And they have developed some vapor permeability. But, wood, the whole idea with painting wood originally was to protect it from the weather so it wouldn't rot as easily. And if you've got, the problem is when they usually go in and redo, of course, they sand it down, which you don't want to do. And then they'll come in and they caulk every little crack. So the way this wood worked is that when moisture got in there, which would happen, it evaporated out of the small cracks and underneath the siding. The clapboard siding was supposed to function that way. That was part of the way that it worked. So you go down there and they say, look, I have checked there's not one crack there, in that. Well, that's exactly how you create a situation where the siding doesn't work the way it should. But I think that, the wood porches, I think, are something you've got to be careful with. But there can be some applicability with those wood. I've seen where they've used it on some sidings of synthetic woods. I haven't. To me, it hasn't performed well. It sags. It doesn't do well with the ultraviolet deterioration and stuff like that. Any other questions? Well, let me say, first of all, again, congratulate you on your service and your volunteerism. As I mentioned many times, I get paid to do this, but you guys do this out of the love of your hearts and your generous donation of your time. Thank you for your hard work. Please consider me a resource. And my cell phone number, call me on I don't get a lot of calls during the year, but every now and then something comes up. You work all day. Feel free to call me in the evenings or the weekend if you need to discuss something you feel like you need to discuss. I'm available for that, and feel free to email me at any time. So again, thank you for inviting me into your community. It's always a pleasure. Murfreesboro is, I taught at MTSU for 4 years as an adjunct professor, in addition to working during the day, but I taught at night over there, so I really enjoyed Murfreesboro quite a bit. Was at a TDOT conference recently. The busiest section of road in the entire state is Interstate 24 between Murfreesboro and Nashville. It's the busiest section in the entire state. And I think within the next 8 or 10 years, it's predicted that the traffic will double. Oh, yeah. So they were telling about where are our priorities in the state and what are we going to try to figure out what we can deal with. It's that one section of road. And why? Because Murfreesboro is such a desirable community and is such a great community that it is one of the most desirable, best places to live in Tennessee. So your success is creating quite an issue there. So congratulations on that and all your good work here. I think the city looks beautiful. Historic areas look beautiful, and it has so much to do with all your hard work. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
This is
Anything
great,
else,
Dan.
Mr. Lewis?
You covered a lot.
Oh, good. And again, follow-up emails if you have an issue. And I come by invitation. So I think people sometimes concerned, I don't want to contact Dan because he's going to come over here and there'll be a ruckus or I don't ever come into communities without an invitation, okay? So it's up to you guys to invite me in if you feel it's appropriate. And I don't take offense with not. If you say, well, Dan, we want to ask you this, but we don't think it'd be good for you to come to a meeting, I think that's oftentimes a very good decision. So just let me know if I can help you in any way.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Nice to see everyone.
Thank you, Dan. I think you and I were adjunct teaching at the same time after the hurricane chased you up here. Is that right? You and I were teaching at the same time after the hurricane chased you up here from New Orleans?
Came up after, and that, again, I'm a native Tennessean.
Yeah.
And 8 generations old. I'm the 8th generation. And grew up here as a kid and went to college down in New Orleans. So ended up meeting my wife, Sandra, got wiped out in Katrina.
Yeah.
And so ended up coming back home, really, is when you look at it. My mom lives in Nashville. And, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Great. You're with the Tennessee Historical Commission, the Certified Local Government Coordinator. We appreciate you coming. So if somebody wants to get a hold of you, because we're on TV, people may call you at the Tennessee Historical Commission.
Yeah, our agency is there also for tax credits, historic tax credits, which are for businesses, okay? That helps. So also National Register, residential, commercial. Our department helps coordinate that. Anyone that would like to have an individual listing for their property or has any questions about the National Register, please direct it to our agency. And we'll be happy to direct it to the people there that can help answer their questions.
All right.
106, which is really a governmental function of overseeing. When federal money's spent in a community, there has to be a review process, which very rarely involves homeowners, but particularly for large commercial businesses. But that's handled usually a much more formal governmental process. But particularly National Register, tax credits for all your downtown, your historic downtowns. Your downtown here is available. I know we've done some here in town, and tax credits. The grants. Our grant program is for primarily public property, okay, or high use. It could be a nonprofit. We give a lot of our money to nonprofits that have a very defined public use, and so again, it can be for building repair. It can also be for master planning of a nonprofit that's got a historic house that they want to turn into a community center or something like that.
Right.
But we're happy to answer those questions. Just let us know at any time, and we'll be
And as a certified local government, we're eligible to apply for grants.
please. Again, I'm available. The next grant cycle, application cycle, begins in November. It's through and ends in January 31st.
Okay.
So what I usually start doing is sometime in the fall we'll talk. Here's some ideas, and what I'll do is help you vet it to make sure that you don't ask for something that I know will never has never been approved in the history of the state. Don't waste your time. So what I can say is, and we'll just bounce some ideas. If you want to call me and say, hey, there's a couple of areas we're thinking about it. We're doing some stuff down here. Is there any grants for that? And my job will be to help you write it. And we also work with the preservation planner in the area. And I think your planner is probably based out of Nashville.
Okay.
So I doubt if she's had much communication. She usually works with the smaller communities as well.
Okay.
But we work together to help write the grants, vet them. And we also will work with you. That preservation planner can help you on National Register stuff in your community. If you want to talk about redoing your inventory, for your city,
Yes.
which typically we recommend that you look at it every 10 years and see where it's at. See if you need to expand it. It's now, everything before 1965 is technically on the register. And we're, for survey work, we're registering stuff before 67. The hard work begins now with ranch houses and ranch neighborhoods. And there's a book the federal government put out in the last couple of years this thick on how to analyze post-World War II housing, which is essentially ranch. And they're saying, how are those districts going to be brought in under, the National Register? Of course, you're on the committee for that. Yeah. We've approved a couple already, haven't we?
Elvis owned it for a while, and they wanted to sell it. But I have to tell you, it actually scares me, the idea of suddenly having these National Register districts of ranch-style houses. It's just like, because I grew up in one. I don't know if it's because it's my own mortality, but it just seems so
They're
odd.
not historic, are they?
They're just not
historic.
There's no character to them.
Well, I'll tell you a good story. Maybe we'll end on this tonight. When I moved to New Orleans in 1973, for most architects there, architecture ended either in the 1890s with Richardsonian Romanesque, or they would go into the 20s and 30s with bungalows.
Yes.
Okay,
But
when I moved to New Orleans, shotgun houses were not historic. Okay, and there was a big fight at the time going, these things are for them. Most of them were built, the biggest swath of them were built in 1890 to the 1930s. So they were saying, they're just not eligible, they're not historic, and now New Orleans has Shotgun Month. And they have neighborhoods that are almost all shotguns that are National Register neighborhoods. And it's the most celebrated housing style in the city. And it was, when I was doing my graduate work, my professor's real old fashioned, and he said, shotgun houses they're just not a lot to them sometimes. And I don't know how historic they can be. He was one of the old school that said they really didn't qualify. But now it's not even a question anymore. They're wildly celebrated. And I think some of that will happen.
It will.
Again, it's a hurdle. I guess I'm probably going to be eligible for retirement in the next 5 or 10 years. And I'm almost saying I'm glad I won't have to be in the middle of that too long.
Well, I think the younger generation's really into this mid-century modern, so that goes with those houses. And
if there's
so
anything,
it's the next generation who's going to look back on it fondly. Those of us who were born in those houses or grew up in those houses, to us, it's of no consequence.
What's red fire hot now amongst millennial preservationists and architects and architectural historians coming up is mid-century modern. And I mean, it's sort of like, forget the 19th century.
And for me, I always ask which mid-century, which century are you talking about? Because the 1950s, the 1850s, oh yeah, great.
Oh, look, there's people, brutalism is a really hard architectural style for me to, and there's so many modernists, and of course in a lot of these neighborhoods, a lot of these cities like Detroit, which have had, there's been discussions of just taking square miles of these 50s, 60s, 70s neighborhoods and just wiping them out and starting over again, because they're not, a lot of times they're feeder roads with cul-de-sacs. They really don't work well. It's a building style that's not used much anymore. It's a building plot plan that's not used much, and so they're saying just to do away with these. And now some of those are coming into National Register consideration. And I was always like, I got to wipe them out, man. Just And of course, you see, I live near Nolensville Road in South Nashville, and it's almost disposable architecture along that road. And a lot of that was, the truth is, a lot of that was meant to be disposable.
Yes, it was.
Those houses were meant to be last no more than 50 years and maybe up to 75, but a lot of the materials in them won't last. A lot of that sheetrock in there is not a 100 to 150-year-old material. That sheetrock is disintegrating now and won't have the structural integrity to exist. And then southern yellow pine, which is one step above rock candy. So
Dan, thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Thank you
we
very
appreciate
much.
being here.
Appreciate it.
Nice to see y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
And we will be in touch about a grant, I think.
Please let me know.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
A lot of them. In fact, it's gotten so good now that a lot of the grants that normally would have been funded in the past, they're missing, because as a CLG you get 10 to 15 extra points, and a high score is 50. So a lot of these grants are scoring 40. They used to be, they would have gotten it. But my CLGs are scoring, the baseline is 40. They're just like the other grants. They're scoring right in there because they get 10 more points.
Yeah.
And so they're getting 80%, 75 to 80% of all the grants now are going to CLGs because of the scoring advantage. And a lot of these people that have been getting grants on and off for years go, why don't I get grants anymore? Well, the CLGs get involved. And there's some good projects that I almost hate not seeing them being funded. Lebanon had a great project with that military academy.
Yeah.
The library at their military academy, they put in a real good grant. But it came down to it, they missed it by about 5 points because the CLGs bumped them out. And I tell you, become a CLG.
Yeah, then
They would have gotten this grant. They would have gotten it. And so we know. So, but we're here to help. It's a free reason. And the other thing, everything we do, and I think it's important to tell the public, everything we do is free. There's no fees for anything we do. There's no, Now, the only exception, I think, with the tax credits, there is something at the federal level when they do the review of the final drawings or something like that. But it's not
minor.
onerous.
No, it's minor.
But for everything we do, National Register, certified, I tell you, all my visits, information, anything, there is no charge for anything.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Good night.
Motion to adjourn without a quorum.
Second?
Yes.
Yeah. We're adjourned.
All in favor? Yes. Okay.
Yes, I think we're
We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
When's the next National Register?